You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 21. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, first code experience, and their first job. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Richard Campbell to the show. Richard Campbell has more than 30 years of high-tech experience and is both a Microsoft Regional Director and a Microsoft MVP. He has consulted with a number of leading North American organizations, including Barnes & Noble, Dow Chemical, Johnson & Johnson, Reuters, Subaru and Isuzu, and the U.S. Air Force. In addition to speaking at conferences around the world, Richard is the co-host of the popular .NET Rocks, the internet audio show for .NET developers, as well as the host of Run As Radio, the internet audio show for the IT professional. I've been interviewed by Richard and Carl on .NET Rocks quite a few times, and it's always fun to talk to him. I also love running into him at conferences and get to have an adult beverage or two with him. In this episode, I get to flip the table. I get to ask him the questions, and he gets to try to answer them. We're going to talk about how he got started, what it's like having an electrical engineer for a father, how the Canadians say the word solder different from us, as well as how he views development and software in general. Let's take a listen. Well, I'm delighted to have Mr. Richard Campbell on the show today. How are you doing today?
I'm enjoying the roles being reversed because I've interviewed you a bunch of times.
You have.
Now it's my turn, I guess, or your turn. I don't know how to phrase that.
Well, I'm a little intimidated because, I'm interviewing you and the roles are always reversed. I'm like, I hope I ask good questions.
Well, in some ways it's really fun to not have to have a plan. I'm just a guest. I will just answer whatever you ask, honestly. I do a lot of planning in most .NET Rocks episodes. There's a lot of thought that goes into that. And so This is relaxing for me. It's Sunday. It's a great day to have a conversation.
So, that begs the question. We're on the Hello World podcast. So, when did you get started? I assume that you were a 6-year-old computer geek with already doing network load balancing. Is that right?
You're not that far off the truth. My father's an electrical engineer. And he was heavily into modular cash register design. So he was helping to invent some of the first electronic cash registers. So technically, my first job ever programming was programming PLUs into an S80 bus cash register circa 1975, 76.
And you were one?
I was 8, 9 years old. Yeah.
Wow.
So, but and my father taught me electronics. Those are my earliest memories, to be perfectly honest. They had these LED, or really they were plasma displays, the two, like Nixie 2 plasma displays for the cash registers, and they were huge. And I had to desolder all of the connectors on it cleanly enough using desoldering wick and vacuum so that I could lift the display off of the board. And then he'd make me solder it all back up again. And then we'd check it to make sure everything lit properly. And then I'd desolder it again. So it was literally like wax on, wax off for electronics.
Wow. So, in your house, instead of having to hold the flashlight right and, in the car engine, he was getting you to the solder that early to.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I realize how deeply embedded that is in my mind, that I never hesitate to this day to take anything apart. I can generally figure it out and repair it, whatever it may be. Our mutual friend Carl Franklin was staying with me for a few days, and he broke his CPAP machine, which that's a serious business for him. So he's like, I need to get another one, and I'm like, no, let me just take a look. And just took it apart and went, oh yeah, look, well, this thing's broken away here, and filed some stuff down and soldered new connections on. It's like, here, you're good. And he's looking at me like, where did that come from? It's like, well, that's from a very young age, that's what I did.
And did you do the same thing with your kids? Did you give them the circuit board and say, I need you to unsolder and resolder everything?
No, my daughters aren't all that geeky. They're more like their mother. They're very crafty.
Interesting.
they make costumes and beautiful cards, and there's always stuff being made around my house, but it's generally not electronic stuff unless it's me.
Interesting. So you went from working on the cash registers with your dad. Did you have a first computer at some point, or?
My parents split very early on. And so I always bounced between the two households. So I was doing the cash register thing when I was living with him. And then I moved back with my mother and met my first PC was in 77. And that was the TRS-80 Model 1 at Radio Shack.
Nice.
And I was there. The only reason I went there, and it was August of 1977. And then August 1977 is a very important time. So I'm 10 years old. And Star Wars has just come out. Mm-hmm. So I have a paper route, and I am spending every penny going to see Star Wars over and over and over. But I was also building an electronic rocket countdown timer.
Nice.
So it was a little box with a single LED display that would count down 9 to 0, and then it would latch a relay to fire a rocket igniter. So I didn't have, because what I realize now is at 10 years old, I was already lazy. Saying 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off, too much work. Let the machine do it.
Yes.
So I went into Radio Shack to get parts for that, and they had this computer in the corner, 4K of RAM and a cassette tape player and a terrible monitor. It was really a modified RCA TV, which I believe is responsible for how bad my vision is. That I just fried my eyes on this crappy monitor.
Yeah.
And a version of Dartmouth Basic, and it only had 3 error messages: what, how, and sorry. So my first line of code was 10 print quote hello world close quote, followed by my second line code 20 go to 10.
Yep. Wow, that's interesting. So the TRS-80 actually is a really common first computer so far.
Yeah.
I'm unsurprising. You know, I thought there would be more VIC-20s and more Apple IIs than there have been, but that's
a generation later. Yeah, I mean, that's a generation later. Plus, there was a bunch of TRS-80s. I mean, the Model 1 was only around for a few years. The Model 2 was a business machine that didn't have a lot of adoption. It was Tandy's Lisa.
Right.
You know, it was too expensive and too complicated. And then they sort of dialed it back with the Model 3, which looked more like, it was more of an all-in-one design, and the Model 4 was sort of the ultimate manifestation of that. And then that was very much a business machine, which was the line I always stayed on. You know, I dabbled in gaming, but I always was more prone to the business type machines. I like the CBM 8032 more than I like the Commodore 64.
Sure.
Although in a lot of ways it was the same kind of hardware. But and the Apple II, I really got into the Apple II with the Z80 card in it, starting to work in CPM. And that's when I started making real money in computing was in the early 80s, still in high school, with Apple IIs with the CPM card and DBase 2.
DBase 2.
Yep.
Wow. And so the TRS-80 had BASIC. Is that, you know, other than Hello World, did you spend a lot of time programming? Because, you know, I think of you as you know, 1/3 programmer, 2/3 hardware guy. I don't know how accurate that is. And
you wouldn't be wrong by a long. I mean, but although more people put weight on the hardware thing because it seems weirder, right? There's just, you know, like you can find programmers, but a guy that'll just rip a machine apart or will build his own or anything like that, that's not that common.
Or that will carry an entire network in a bag through TSA. Yeah,
through the security, right? Like that was just that's a much odder thing to do. And I don't think much about hardware in that sense. It's something I've always done. And so it doesn't seem like a big deal to me where I really focus on programming. But, you know, most of the programming that I do these days is all performance tuning stuff. I rarely get to write the first generation of anything.
Sure.
It's mostly, how do I make this faster? And I learned a lot of the stuff that I've gotten really good at over the years has been, hey, you know, make these stored procedures faster. So, you know, I sort of knew my way around SQL, but I got good at SQL, making stuff go fast.
Yeah.
And same with C#, you know, the same with 6502 assembler. I hate to say it, but, you know, like that was always the thing, was because I was good with the metal. I looked at programming differently. I had a very strong sense of how IO worked. I mean, that was always the problem, was how do we make that stuff go faster? So I always fell into that particular niche, for better or worse. But I got lucky early on. By the time when I graduated from high school in '84, I'd already been programming for a number of years, and I'd really never done anything else. I'd repaired By then I'd had several different jobs repairing different kinds of computers. Didn't think anything of that. That was a normal job.
Sure.
I got involved in the first generation of networking, where you actually had to drill your own, thick ether. You would lay down a backbone of cable that was basically not flexible. And this was almost an inch thick piece of cable. It could only be about 300 feet long, and it had end caps. And then you had a drill that you went into the side of the cable on to strap on the taps to connect computers to it. And that was a thinner cable. That was RG58 cable that you could drop down from the ceiling to plug into the computer with a BNC connector.
And those BNCs were those little saddle turn ones, right?
Yeah, sort of turn latch.
Yeah,
and most were mostly 100 kilobit cable, as opposed to 10 gigabit cable using now.
And what kind of networking was that back then? I mean, we all think of Ethernet as being ubiquitous, but I remember Ethernet becoming a thing, pretty late in my career.
Well, that was actually still called Ethernet. That was still Met class design. That was thick ether is what they called it.
Oh, okay.
And with the tap system. And it was expensive. And so then a low-cost version similar to it called ArcNet came along, which only used the RG58. Mm-hmm. And that was easier to work with because you didn't have to drill it. And you can see how I got involved with this because I was always good with my hands with the hardware. The whole idea of drilling and tapping wasn't scary to me.
Yeah.
So I ended up in ceilings, hanging on, and I believe it or not, me today is a fairly large guy. I was a little weedy guy when I was 10 to 15 when I was doing this kind of work. I was small enough that they loved me up in the ceilings because I was fast and I could drill, and I was meticulous enough to do the drops precisely because it was very easy to screw up a cable, and you screw up a 300-foot long piece of thick ether. Like, that's the $2,000 piece of cable. People are very angry if you damage that cable. So you didn't mess around with that. But yeah, I ended up doing all that kind of ether. The Ethernet switching over to modular cabling to the RJ45 jack, that came later. Mostly I think when IBM screwed up with Token Ring.
Yeah.
The Token Ring plug was just horrifying. It was such a good networking protocol, and it was such a bad plug. I think they sunk their product with the plug.
That wouldn't be the first or the last time that IBM would do that.
and other companies to boot. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, so for better or worse, I've always have been involved in the hardware side of this stuff. And so it kind of makes sense that I ended up in the performance tuning world just because I was kind of literate in how the PCs worked, how the networking worked, how databases worked, and how those pieces went together so that you had a better view of where the problems might lie.
So you had mentioned DB2 on, not DB2, DBase2 on CP/M. What kind of work were you doing then?
That was an era, that was such a fun time to program because you were basically just knocking down business cases. So I lucked out that by the time I graduated, I had fallen in with a guy who was an accountant. His name was Lionel, and he was so I am 18. And he's 60. And we met at a bailiff shop. So this was a place that does repossessions for companies that are going bankrupt. And in the middle 80s, lots of people going bankrupt, right? It was like it was a tough time in the world.
It was the only booming business at the time was
bailiffs,
the bankruptcy business.
And so it was a great place to pick up cheap hardware for not only because they repossessed a lot of it, but they had no idea what they had. Right. So often you could score, the average bailiff can't tell the difference between a 16K machine and a 64K machine, but it's literally 3 times the price of the computer.
Right.
So the fact that I could, grab this higher end hardware, and here's this old Jewish guy doing the same thing, and he knows his way around the hardware too. So we start talking, and he's probably one of my most important mentors in my life was Lionel, in the sense that he just made me think about the business side of stuff. And so how I ended up deeply immersed in DBase2 was that it was incredibly good at solving straightforward business problems, straight up automation. How do I make this form digital so that you don't have to retype it, so that you don't have to photocopy it, so that you can take 100 of them and get totals from them, do that.
Yeah.
And so the apps were fairly straight ahead, and typically 6 to 12 week engagements make the app work. And then every time the tax code changes, you come back and tweak it a little kind of thing. And you just sort of build up a repertoire of them. And
you are the programming staff. I mean, back then, having a group of people working together, at least my memory in 87 was that it was always the one guy, and it was me in a dark room someplace trying to hack this together.
Yeah, and largely, and you also got to spec out the hardware when you got it to work. They're like, okay, now we need 10 people to use this thing.
Yep.
So then you spec'd out, well, these are the PCs that'll run on. This is the networking we're going to use. Eventually, when we got to centralized databases, this was the database you're going to use. I mean, you were IT and operations and development all in one. I eventually got involved in organizations by the late 80s, early 90s, where I had 2 guys, and me. But that, it was very much a small business model. And DBase was super good to me. I made a lot of money off of DBase because it looked really simple, but you could make a terrible mess.
You could.
So I eventually fell into this cadence, and this is like 87, 88, where I take the summer off because in the summertime, all of the first year ComSci students would go and try and do programming for the summer. And so they would somehow talk a company into that they wanted a piece of software. They'd spend the whole summer trying to write it. They would screw it up. And at the end of the summer, if I tried to get work in the summer, he was like, why would I use you when I can get this kid? He's 10th year price. And I'm like, okay, so I'll just take the summer off. September, when that kid goes back to university and you don't have anything, or you've got, a set of specs and half thought through and code that doesn't run properly, then we talk. And we sort of figure out how to fix it and make a plan. And I'd basically book out 6-8 months worth of work just cleaning up the mess. I started loving first year ComSci students. It was awesome.
Because they're just full of optimism and hope.
Yeah, and you don't get crushed till the end of August, and I'm still on vacation. Then I'm fishing. What do I care?
So even back then, you were really swooping in to help solve individual problems like you do today
most of the time. And again, it's like Lionel taught me to solve the business problem and to think that way about it, right? And really look at that, and take the ego out of a lot of that. Mm-hmm. It's like, hey, the goal here is actually make this thing work, and we'll find a way. So I never burned a customer because the customer said, hey, you're too expensive. It's like, it's okay. There's always more work than you can do,
right?
But if you change your mind, here's my number. And I promise not to say I told you so more than once.
More than once. That's funny. So in those early days, did you have places you could go and sort of talk out problems, or did you feel like you were in isolation programming wise?
I didn't. The hobbyist clubs of the era, and they existed. I was interested in the hardware side, but the way they talked about software to me seemed insane because I thought about software from a business perspective, mm-hmm. not from a hobbyist perspective.
Right.
So that didn't engage me all that much. The first time I really found community was on CompuServe.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that was the first time I fell in with folks and it was the Clipper community on CompuServe was the first community that I sort of, these are my people, right? Where I'm searching for Clipper was the compiled version of DBase. I was never a FoxPro guy. But the Clipper company was really small and kind of disorganized. And so by 88 or so, they were having problems. And so we all had to help each other. And the CompuServe was where we did that.
That's interesting. You and I have known each other for I don't know how many years now. And the fact that we were both on CompuServe Clipper at the same time is remarkable.
We probably exchanged messages. You know that, Sean. We probably did. That's almost certain, don't you think?
Yeah.
That community was maybe 2,000 people.
Maybe.
Total. So I have clearly read your stuff and you've read my stuff. You know who I met back in that era was Paul Sheriff.
Oh, yeah.
Because he was an old Clipper guy, too.
In that space.
Yeah, and he made library tools. He was also one of the very first speakers I ever saw. That I actually went to a database-oriented conference, and that was Clipper and Fox friendly. and I think also Access, because it was like 91 or 92. And went to this conference that Jeff Winchell ran. There's an old name from the past, out of Seattle. And met Paul, and I saw Paul Sheriff speak, and I went up and shook his hand and just thanked him very much for his contributions to CompuServe. And he was involved with a product called Grumpfish back in the day. And I'm like, and I, love that work. And the funny part is, several years later, I wouldn't start speaking until like 96, 97, when VB and Access ruled the world. And then I would end up speaking at the same conference as Paul and say, "You don't remember, bud." He's like, "Oh no, I remember," because most people just come up and say very clearly, "Thank you for this." You know what you're talking about. So I mean, I've known Paul forever.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Somehow you and I never made that connection, but we were right in the same place at the same time.
That's interesting. I remember going to the once Computer Associates bought Clipper, and the dark day that was.
Where good software goes to die. Right?
CA World, where they had Clipper there, and they had 100 of us who showed up in this little hotel way off away from the other 50,000 attendees, and that's when I really knew, this is not going to be good for Clipper.
No, and I had the misfortune of using other products, networking products and backup products that had been bought by CA and killed,
Yeah.
And that's what computers, that's what I say. Computer Associates is where good software goes to die.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so as soon as that happened, I hopped over to VB. That was about for a while, I was struggling with whether to go to Windows, right? I mean, that was the battle, right? Was when do we go to Windows? Because I didn't like Windows. I thought taking your hand off of the keyboard and putting on the mouse was catastrophically stupid. Like, what are you thinking, right? And until I had a customer who needed to generate faxes automatically,
right?
Because I started working in DOS on a fax driver, and I wanted to kill myself, right? Because it was just horrible.
Yeah. The
whole process of how you were supposed to render a page at that level. And then I looked at, this is now Windows 3, right? This is 1991, 92. So I'm looking at Windows 3 and this concept of the device context. It's like, there's really no difference than generating an image that goes to the screen or goes to a printer or goes to a fax.
Right. It's all generalized.
You just want a device context. I'm like, okay, I now appreciate Windows because it took care of the driver problem. The other thing that was going on in that era, I made a lot of money actually figuring out what printer a company should buy based on the software they were using. Like, I kept charts of, okay, so you want to use Framework, and you also want to use this CRM software. It's like, you got these 3 packages you want to use. Well, here are the drivers that are available for each one of those packages, which is the Venn, now do the Venn diagram of printer intersections. And it comes down to the 6 printers that actually have drivers in all of this software. This is your choice. And then Windows just made that go away.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, now you just need a Windows driver and stuff works.
Stuff works. Wow. So you didn't get pulled into Visual Objects.
No. I think I'm grateful. To be honest.
Absolutely. I spent the worst programming year of my life working on Visual Objects, which was, sort of the, for those who aren't familiar, it's the Windows version of Clipper, sort of.
Kind
of debugger maybe. That didn't work, and 15-minute compile times, and
it was so brutal.
It was just awful.
I thank God they took so long to ship it because I needed to eat, and so I had to switch.
Yeah.
Well, and in the early versions of, I looked at Access and I'm like, it's Vox under the hood, and I'm not a fan. Yeah. Right. And at that point, I was already starting to play with Sybase. Mm-hmm. So, that was there, and it was a better database. And I had customers that were getting to a scale where we needed to store and handle more data than DBFs were really safe to use. Right.
Yeah.
And I was starting to decompose DBFs. I was doing a lot of tricks to keep the system stable, but it was still, and networking was getting fast enough. Like, all of this stuff was possible. So that I was already on the lookout for this solution. And so then CA buys Clipper, late 92, 93. And that's when VB2 came out.
Yeah.
And I could dig VB2. VB1 was pretty rough, and Access annoyed me. But VB2, there was a third-party library called SQL Sombrero.
Mm.
It was a VBX, and it was specifically for speaking to Sybase 4.2.
Interesting.
And I had this customer who wanted to move to Windows. They wanted to get rid of Clipper. And they had a Clipper app that I hadn't written, and it was not a bad Clipper app. And they wanted it, but they sort of hit the wall with Clipper, which is what happened a lot. So I was brought in because I was the guy who could make Clipper go further. But they really wanted to get to Windows. So I undid their initial limitations, splitting the DBS out and so forth, so that we could keep going with more users. And then I said, they basically funded me getting up to speed with VB, bringing in Sybase, and building a real client server app against Visual Basic 2. And it wasn't easy, but you get pretty clinical about it. At that point, you realize you've changed languages 4 or 5 times now already.
Yeah.
Like, you're just not afraid. You say I need to build a CRUD app. How do I add a record? How to delete a record? How do I modify a record? How do I show a list of them? How do I search for something? Like, there's just some stuff you need to do. And once you figure those things out, now we start thinking about proper visualizations and proper documentation. And this was a marketing company I was working with, and they needed to spit out a lot of printed material. They were making custom printed letters with envelopes and things like that. And so list management was a huge business for them.
Yeah.
And it was great exercise just to sort of work your way through that. And so, VB was very good to me. I rode the VB wave right to the bitter end.
Interesting, because I remember the cognitive switch over to VB as well, and it was comfortable, but it always felt a little awkward to me. We were trying to do, I think, way too much with it at my first sort of VB job, where we were using wireless networks and touch computers with Windows 95 pen extensions and all that, and it was just too much for VB to handle. And so I had to make that switch finally to C++ to just get around all these little VB-isms.
And see, I ended up dabbling because I needed to control printers really, really well.
Yeah.
In VB, and by VB3, it's like, okay, here are 4 $10,000 printers that have envelope feeders and different types of stock, and you have to do custom printing on all of them. I was using DDE to speak to Word 4 to do custom inserts, so that the regular staff could create the documents. You didn't need me to create the documents. They could actually hook them successfully to the app. So I'm building a list management app, but then actually having it print an envelope with the custom name on it and print the letter with the custom name on it properly, and whatever the offer was stacked so that they can be stuffed efficiently. That was a big deal. And
of course, DDE worked every time.
Oh, yeah. DDE was incredibly reliable. And I laid my hands on Appleman's book on using the Win32 API in VB. And because I needed to dig deeply into device context to be able to control these printers in a much more sophisticated way than VB was really meant to do, because VB was just wrapped a little too high level for a bunch of stuff, but you could penetrate underneath it. And Appleman, to this day, and I'm so grateful that I've had a chance to say this to his face, but he taught me what it meant to be a great member of the community. Because I got stuck, and I emailed him on CompuServe, and he answered me in an hour.
He's that kind of guy.
Yeah. And after a while of having a steady dialogue with him about this, I'm like, I don't understand how you can do this. How can you? I mean, I'm really grateful that you're helping me with this, but I don't know how, you've got a job. Like, how are you answering me? And he said, it doesn't take as long as you think when people have actually thought through their questions. Because I had really worked hard before I finally reached out to the guy to try and figure this out. I was asking hard questions. But yeah, he was one of those people that I thought, if I ever get a chance to be serious in the community, I'm going to be like Dan Elfman. I'm just going to be responsive. And there was another guy, John Murdoch, who wrote for Database Advisor, and he wrote in a very storytelling style. Every one of his articles, he had a character called Fat Charlie. And so it was always Fat Charlie was doing this with this, and this is how he solved the problem. And I just liked the way he wrote it. So between Murdoch and Appelman were sort of my guys of, if I get a chance to be part of more immersive community other than just the guy who's asking questions, that's the people I want to be. And
that's certainly that's the public persona that I saw when I first heard about you and met you and heard you on the podcast and all that. Was there was a storytelling was important, and your availability was really obvious.
Yeah.
Or approachability. That's the word
I'm glad I got to do that.
Yeah. I never felt like you thought you were as important as you really were, which seems to be a bit of an epidemic in our industry.
I find that one of the tactics that talented technical people fall into when you present, okay, when you're trying to communicate information, there's a bunch of different ways to go about it. And one of the very common tactics is, I am the smartest person in the room. Let me show you that I am the smartest person in the room. And if you don't understand this, it's because you're just not smart enough.
Right. Which
is unfair. But for better or worse, it works. It appeals to a certain audience, and it's not like it's ineffective.
Right.
It's just not my nature. At best, the way I would approach speaking at conferences: hi, I've screwed up first. Please don't make these mistakes. And then, outline the mistakes. I'm not especially smart. I've just got here early and got beat up by these things, and I would save you my pain.
Exactly. And so when did you end up going to college, or you just started working and that just...
Yeah, I am. I rarely talk about these things, but when I was just getting computing, when I was like 10, 11 years old, I was identified as, an exceptional mind and offered a free ride essentially for middle school, high school, university in physics. I was fascinated by atomic theory even back then. And so had done a paper presentation, almost like show and tell piece in, grade 6. On Niels Bohr's atomic model and Rutherford's relation. The atomic model is what Niels Bohr's PhD thesis was,
right?
Which is fascinating. He worked for a guy named Rutherford, who was a Kiwi, who was the first guy to sort of prove conjecture and create some evidence that there was concept of a nuclei in an atom. This is just not that long ago either, by the way. I just fascinated by, we just take it for granted that this is the way things are, but they were just figuring this stuff out. And so, I ended up not going. Mostly, I think it just freaked my mother out that at that age I would disappear into the system. I would have been a physicist,
right?
Which not a bad outcome, but that it didn't go that way. And I fell in with entrepreneurial folks in an industry. I'm a sort of a generation zero computer person.
Yeah,
and my father proved he never particularly cared about computing. And he's 70 now, and just getting around to retirement. He does love electronics, but he never was comfortable computing. So he just stayed on the electronic side of this and admitted his sort of limitation there and just said, no, you should stay in computing if that's what you enjoy. So yeah, by the time I was graduating high school and being offered to go be dragged into different universities again as a guy who was heavily into computing science, I was making too much money.
Yeah.
And yeah, so when you're 18 and out earning your parents and living on your own, and somebody wants you to go study university, you're like, for what? and I only think it's because I got in early that I was so far ahead of a lot of folks. It's caused issues for me later in life, right? Like getting a visa to work in the US without a degree in computing science is a problem.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how much experience I've got, it's that I don't have a recognized qualification in this, but I'm more of an engineer than a scientist anyway. Like I prefer thinking about how things work and I'm really good study at business flow. If there's anything I'm good at, it's I can work out a business model by lunchtime on Monday. I understand how your business works. And in the end, we're making good business software. What are we really talking about? But understand the flow of the business and then find ways to automate it. Let it go faster or instrument it better. That's only the two things you're going to do.
Right.
Right. Well, a guy that used to do 25 invoices a day now does 100 invoices in a day. Or we're able to analyze, customer opportunities in more detail, so we can widen the pipeline, we can decrease bounce rate, we can increase sales per unit, that sort of thing. But
you talk about your lack of a degree, making it harder to get a visa in the States, which doesn't surprise me. Has there also been sort of an emotional component? You felt like, oh, this is something I should have done, or this is something that people do, or this is what I should have learned, in a formal way that I know now, but I have no proof that I know it. Did any of that go on?
No, I don't think that way. I'm too busy learning. So, I mean, if folks who listen to the shows have a pretty good sense, I'm interested in a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
If you look at my OneNote record notes, you'll see, like, I'm the kind of guy who I just came back from 2 weeks in Mexico, right? Sort of a half work, half play vacation time. And so normal for me was Kindle in one hand, reading some serious text, and phone in the other hand, making notes in OneNote on stuff I wanted to dig into more detail on, which I was allowed to do for about 3 days before Stacy's like, you're only allowed to read fiction because you need to stop. And so I promised I wouldn't start any more and I consume books at kind of a voracious rate. I've done as many as 100 books in a year. I did 10 books in 2 weeks in Mexico.
Wow.
But that's normal for me. I mean, I just consume, it's very normal for me to finish a book on a flight and take notes through the whole thing because I had this stuff I want to go back and reference. And so, I've never not been learning. I just find most learning mechanisms too slow.
Yeah.
So I'm a reader. I mean, and I realized long time ago, in the 90s when I sort of switched over to becoming a speaker and a trainer and things like that, what I realized is my actual useful skill was taking the written material about a technology and then turning it into other forms that more people could consume.
Interesting.
Whether that's articles or courseware or video or podcast, that's what I do.
Yeah.
Day in, day out. Or, taking something really dry. Like if you read the NEA's analysis of 3 Mile Island, like you will fall asleep. Mm-hmm. It's unbelievably dry. But there's an incredibly interesting story in those words if you pull it out. And that, for me as someone who really enjoys telling a story, going through the raw material. I even did this in this bloody trip to Mexico. There's a temple, an hour drive outside of Acapulco, called Tehuacalco, and it's from 800 AD. It predates the Aztecs by about 500 years, but it's got a ball court, but it's aligned wrong, and it's got sun temples, and it's got an equinox alignment system built into it, and it's from a culture called the Yope. I can't find bugger all research about this, but I sat down with the archaeologist that's working with it there and got a good picture of this, and it's like, this is Aztec style architecture without the artwork, and it's 500 years older. Like, that's a big deal.
That's a huge 500 years in those time frames is enormous.
When you think of the Aztec culture existed for a total of 200 years, right? From the 1320 something to 1500 something when Hernandez shows up. Like, that's the whole Aztec civilization. And here's this structure that predates it by hundreds of years, which to me is the best vacation you could possibly have. Like, that was my favorite day of 2 weeks in Mexico was bombing around this site in 40-degree heat, just smoking hot. I got sunburned. My wife's fed up with me. The archaeologist is like, you want to look at more,
And and Stacy's done at that point.
She's like, she just went back and got a beer, right? Like, thank goodness there was a beer to be had. But she also we've been married 20 years. She's not surprised.
No.
She knew perfectly well what was going to happen. But, exactly. For me, my reaction to a north-south aligned ball court when every other ball court ever found is east-west aligned, I'm freaking out.
That continual learning thing is so important, especially if it's not It's not something that is your goal. It's just the way that so many of us are made up of,
Yeah. Now, I'm admittedly, I'm a storyteller, but the only way to be a good storyteller is to collect stories.
Yeah.
And so you have to be a good listener too. You have to be a good observer and just be part of what's going on out there and see these things and want to know more, and it helped, then to do the debrief with the tour guide to say, I don't know if you get what you've got here, but here's how I would present this to other people to draw them in. Because I'm super excited about this. And what you told me about it to get me to go wasn't any of these things.
Exactly. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Well, it's great to talk to you, Sean.
Yeah,
and
I always love our chats.
We always have a good time together. And I'm going to see it build.
Nope. Not with the upcoming wedding. I am not allowed to travel before May 31st.
Right. Well, plus your whole life's about to change, too.
It is. And
congratulations. That couldn't happen to a nicer guy.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, things are going to get weird for a while, but it'll be fun.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of adventure,
Absolutely. But we'll catch up at I'm sure the next conference we're both at, TechEd or something.
That's inevitable.
Like that.
Or a show, one or the other.
Absolutely.
Or both.
Absolutely.
You bet.
You have a